Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Tom Romanoff, the Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Technology Project. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event on facial recognition technology, governance challenges, and opportunities. Just yesterday, BPC wrapped up a series of blogs and explainer pieces that analyzed how the many terms and definitions, functional applications, use cases, methods of assessing accuracy and performance, as well as risks and benefits, can make developing and advancing bipartisan federal face recognition technology a little challenging. Today, I'm excited to hear expert perspectives on these challenges and the opportunities to move forward with legislation that directly addresses facial recognition technologies, or broader data privacy and AI governance legislation as well. Later on, BPC has our own Gabrielle Shea, who will moderate this discussion between three expert panelists, Tatiana Rice, Dr. Michael King, and Samuel Peterson. We will also have a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit questions via the comment section of YouTube. Before that panel begins, I'm very excited. We're fortunate to hear a keynote from one of the foremost experts on facial recognition algorithm performance testing, Patrick Grother. Patrick is a scientist in the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Science and Technologies, NIST, where he leads NIST's biometric standards and technology evaluation work, including face recognition vendor test program. There is plenty more that we could share about Patrick and his many accomplishments, but in the interest of time, I'll turn it over to him to tell us a little bit more about the FRVT.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, Gabby, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join BPC today, and I should like to bring the slides up. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about facial recognition technology and the state of the art, state of play. My name is Patrick Grother. I work for NIST. We are part of the Commerce Department, a non-regulatory, non-policy agency. We do measurement and we give quantitative support for standards. And in that respect, we have for 20 years been running something called the FRVT, the Face Recognition Vendor Test. And that is a set of open benchmarks open to a worldwide community of developers. We do this independently, of course. We do it for free. We make our reports public. Everything is done transparently. The metrics, the procedures, and the results. We use large-scale image databases that have been shared with us from our partners across the US government. And that gives us sort of the scientific method of statistically robust, repeatable measurements. We do this quite quickly. We report monthly. We are open to any developer pretty much worldwide at any time. And we protect IP. So this is a black box test. You can see there are 8 tracks listed there. At the bottom is the one we have just announced last week. And that is on age estimation, and I will get to that. But we have 7 other tracks, and they are broadly intended to bring maturity to the face recognition industry by establishing some independent benchmarks against which the technology can prove itself. And these are open and competitive. We measure accuracy, we measure speed, we measure vulnerability and sensitivity in these various areas. And I'm going to touch on most of these in the coming slides. So what is the main role of FRVT? The first primary role is to say, how good is face recognition in some absolute sense? Is it fit for purpose? Can it do the job? And under what circumstances can it not do the job? So what are the limiting factors? And I'll show you some of those coming up. It also has this effect of making a competitive landscape. So if you're an algorithm developer and you would like to know how well your technology works relative to others, then FRVT is a good place to actually find that out. And so which developer is best? What does best even mean? and how are things evolving since the past. So what does best mean? Is it the most accurate? Is it the fastest? Is it the least biased? A whole set of sort of technical metrics define what best means. And we publish those and we guide industry essentially to do the right thing. And that is, of course, a conversation with industry and with end users. And you can see sort of different communities that consume our test outputs on the right-hand side. So policymakers, end users, primarily the developers, but standards makers also, test labs, and regulators worldwide. So this certainly doesn't apply to just US government activity in the area. A final bullet here is that face recognition is just a technology that's useful for certain things. There are alternatives within biometrics. You can maybe use fingerprints to do that, or maybe you wouldn't use non-biometric means. So border crossing for generations was done with human border guards looking at passports. Nowadays, it's done with automation and face recognition automation. What are the pros and cons of that? And that's quite a long discussion, but that's we try to inform that question as well. So I mentioned age estimation. This is our newest track. In short, an image goes into some software, and what comes out is an age estimate. I just did this with one of the leading developers in the industry, and they guessed 2 years on the low side, which was gratifying. But obviously, we age. As we age, face changes, and so the ability to check at age 16, age 18, age 21, the sort of the primary metrics of interest for the policymakers who are currently looking at writing, say, child safety or online safety regulations around age verification. So we do what we usually do. We publish an interface, an application programming interface, and a concept of operations. We put that out for public comment, and then we start testing. And then pretty quickly thereafter, we would start reporting capability. And that would be open worldwide. So that's the age estimation story. Age estimation falls into a category called face analysis. And so a single image goes in, and you can do various things with that. You could try and guess, is it male or female? Digital marketing people are interested in doing that. Face analysis, age estimation, I just told you about. There's a whole lot of controversial and unproven analysis things that you might do. You might look at somebody's photo and try to determine whether they smoke or not. We have not worked on those. We don't intend to work on those. Some of those are obviously bordering on junk science. And so a point to make here is that these analysis activities have got nothing to do with face recognition. Face recognition is to do with identity. And so, and it's the utility of face recognition is in being able to answer sort of two questions. Is it the same person or not? And then who is this person? So this is how the technology works in a nutshell. There's a black box where a lot of high-end intellectual property resides. A face goes into that, and what comes out is a template. And that's the industry term. The academics would use the term embedding or model. And the template is just a set of numbers. And these numbers represent identity. They encode identity-related information from the face. And the networks are very good at finding out what makes you, you in terms of appearance. On the right side, we get another face. We put it through the exact same process, and then it comes down to box number 2 to compare the two templates. That's a simple bit of code generally, and it will produce a similarity score. If the similarity is high, you would say it's the same person. If the similarity is low, you would say it's a different person. So that is how the technology operates. Once you buy an algorithm, these components are fixed. Training doesn't usually happen in the customer workplace. It is done long ago in a lab somewhere. So if we apply that, how good is the technology today? And I can tell you there's been an industrial revolution. Maybe dating myself here, but here's two photos of John Lennon in the early 60s and the late 60s after Yoko Ono joined him. And you can see there's quite a marked change in appearance here. The eyeglasses, the orientation of the head, and of course, occlusion from quite a full beard. When we use those photos now, 9 years ago, with the leading algorithms of the time, and still leading algorithms today, that would fail. Those pair of photos would not be authenticated. Nowadays, all the algorithms, many of the algorithms will give you quite a strong match. So this is a remarkable ability of the algorithms to look through what you would call superficial detail and to look at identity. And apologies to show you a graph, but I had to do it because this is essentially a Moore's law for face recognition. This is an error rate, how often a match cannot be made. And you can see that over 5 different large-scale data sets, the error rate in the purple case there has come down from about 28% down to about 0.2%. So that is more than a 100-fold reduction in error rate. So that is sort of a standard performance metric expressing the ability of the algorithms to handle difficult images. What they couldn't do in 2020 or 2018, they can do today. And so this represents an increase in tolerance for change in appearance of a face in a photo, but still the same person. So one-to-many technology, this is the object of regulation in large part. This is where face recognition becomes very, very useful. We build databases. So we put templates in databases and we associate them with metadata. So Customs and Border Protection might put Alice in a database and associate it with her alien ID number and say when she did an entry into the United States. They might use that later in a one-to-many search to say when she exited the United States. So that's the entry-exit mandate on CBP. The DoD, on the other hand, might have said, they might have put a camera on an embassy in, say, Khartoum in the late 1990s, and they would have known nothing about the person, but that they saw the face in this location. And if that person was coming back daily, they might have had an opportunity to wonder why. Again, lots of people can populate databases for lots of different reasons. Databases can be as small as 2 and as big as 1 billion, and maybe larger nowadays. Accuracy, of course, varies with the database size, but this is where the money is at in face recognition today. How accurate is face recognition? And I'm going to make a sort of a controversial statement here and say that face recognition search of a big database will succeed 100% of the time if you're using a leading capable algorithm, and they're not all in that category by any means. That if you're searching a database, there has to be a mate in the database. There has to be something to find. If there's a haystack with no needle in it, you can't find it. Also, aging matters. So if you put a 50-year-old photograph, it's likely to fail. And that's a sort of a slow, graceful problem, the aging problem. But then bullet number D here is that the photos involved must have what I've called limited quality problems. And you can see along the bottom of this slide, there's a spectrum of quality that goes from very good on the left to bad in the middle and to absolutely ugly on the right side. And face recognition is operable today if the properties of the photos exist within what you would call a capture envelope. And I use that term deriving from sort of aviation, that you can't fly an aircraft outside of its sort of aerodynamic or performance envelope. And what defines that envelope is a whole set of different quality parameters, things like resolution and illumination and the orientation of the head. I put a but on this slide. So this is quite a rosy picture. It's kind of a rosy statement to say things are going to work 100% of the time. But there are some problems. And one problem involves 3% of the population. So in the United States today, 3% of all babies born are twins. And face recognition is contemporary face recognition. Even the leading algorithms are not able to tell identical twins apart. And on the right side here, my colleague and her sister also give false matches. So they're not identical twins. They have 50% homologous DNA, and they're giving false matches. And of course, this is not an ideal outcome. It has to be planned for by somebody who's deploying face recognition. There has to be an understanding that if you were to search a twin, and you might find the twin coming back from a database search, for example. It also means that you might be able to open somebody's phone if it was face-based and it had an algorithm that was vulnerable to this. But this is quite common. Indeed, we challenged industry to send us algorithms that will disambiguate twins, and industry has so far failed to do that. And there are technical reasons why that's true, but twins are a problem. Another problem is, and you will understand looking at the image on the left, that what we've done here is we've graphically put images of George W. Bush and Barack Obama into a single photo. And this is a process called morphing. And I applied for a passport actually just yesterday, and that passport renewal process takes a photo, a printed photo attached to a form, and that photo, if I was an adverse attacker, could be a morph. If that photo were to go through the State Department machinery and end up on my passport, that passport would be usable by two people. Now, the trouble with morphs is that if you look at them and you don't know the people involved, then it just looks like a regular photo. If you're young enough not to remember Barack Obama and George W. Bush, then you might look at that photo and think it's just a real photo. There are detection opportunities for morphs, but it is very difficult. And the gold standard now, particularly, is to trust your capture and not allow photos to be injected into a system that could be morphs. So Germany is going to live passport applications where you have to go to an office and be interviewed by a trusted official. Okay, so we'll move on. Another area where technology is maturing quite rapidly in face recognition is to do with a sort of an adversarial attack. And these are called presentation attacks, where you walk up to a camera, maybe wearing cosmetics, or maybe wearing a face mask, and you try to subvert the intended operation of the system. Now, that can be spoofing for me to become somebody else, to open somebody else's phone, or it could be evasion, where I just don't want to be me. So maybe I'd like to double dip on unemployment benefits or immigration benefits. And if I can do those two attacks, then I can subvert the system. The photo on the bottom left there, the old gentleman, that is a face mask, and this person went through an airport and was only detected because somebody saw him taking the mask off. Probably not very comfortable to wear. But technical means exist nowadays to try and find these attacks, but it is a maturing field. We talk daily about demographic effects in face recognition, and this story comes in two parts, the bias story. Part one is to do with bad photography, and this is a physics problem. If you shine light on skin that doesn't reflect a lot of light, then you get a bad photo. And you can see examples of that here. You can get underexposure and you can get overexposure. And lack of detail will cause an algorithm to fail. So that is one source of bias. And Google addressed this for non-biometric means in their recent phones. So they're using quite sophisticated optics and computational processing to produce equitable images, where all images become attractive. This was done for non-biometric reasons. In principle, it can be done for biometric value too, but that's an ongoing conversation. That's part one of the bias story. Part two is a much, much bigger problem, and this is it's squarely in the laps of algorithm developers, and this concerns false positives. On the right-hand side here is a story coming out of the Midwest, where a young woman goes into, I think, a skating rink and is kicked out because they were running face recognition and a watch list. And there was a mistaken identity by the algorithm, and that false positive ended up being resulting in somebody being evicted from a skating rink. Obviously, that could have bigger implications in other settings, but these false positive rates, the rate at which that kind of adverse event would occur, varies quite a lot across demographic groups. Particularly, they're higher in women and ethnicities that are unknown to the algorithm, including East Asian, African typically, and also the very young babies, and also the very old. And that is probably because the algorithms are not are used to looking at faces like that in that category. They haven't been built that way. This becomes critical in areas in applications where you're going to be doing a lot of transactions, and a lot of transactions where there is nobody in the database. There is no mate in the database. So if I go to a casino, I'm not on the compulsive gamblers list or the card cheating list. And so a false positive would have me thrown out of a casino. And that is a bias problem that is the job of the algorithm developers to fix. And we track in FRVT the capability of the technology to do that today. So this is my last slide. Wrapping up, as a summary, we can say that face recognition is markedly more capable than it was just a few years ago. The gains across the industry are broad, but still there are some bad algorithms out there, so you have to be quite careful about your procurement. The maturation is needed and solutions are needed in various areas that I touched on. Twins, attack detection, this demographics problem. Aging inevitably will change the face. That's a research problem. And also quality assessment. You would like to be able to conclude when an image is not suitable for face recognition. This whole sort of landscape, these technical measurements sort of imply some policies that you might want to regulate even a perfect system. If you've got a system that can do Big Brother, do we want that as a society? We would also like to exclude systems that are in some way defective or bad and are going to lead to mistakes. And policy could do that. Also, some regulations I feel are needed in how we involve humans in face recognition. There have been some cases of wrongful arrest in the United States recently, and they have been in large part attributable to human behavior consuming face recognition results. I'd like to say thank you to a number of government agencies that we work with, also to the BBC, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that insightful presentation, Patrick. I'm Gabrielle Shea, the Senior Policy Analyst on BPC's tech team, and I'm happy to share that Patrick has graciously agreed to stick around for a brief Q&A at the end of today's event. So if anyone has questions for Patrick, please feel free to submit them via the comments function on YouTube. Our esteemed panelists will be available for Q&A as well, so please also feel free to submit questions for them. I encourage you all to look up our panelists and their extensive, robust work on face recognition technologies and related policy issues. But I do want to briefly introduce them before we get started. Tatiana Rice is a senior counsel on FPF's Future of Privacy Forum's U.S. legislation team, and she leads the Future of Privacy Forum's biometrics workstream. In her role at FPF, she researches and analyzes legal and legislative trends relating to consumer data privacy, biometric technologies, and privacy enforcement on both the federal and state levels. I've had the pleasure of listening to some of her updates, highly recommend them for anyone who hasn't tuned in yet. Dr. Michael King is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Engineering and Sciences, and a research scientist for the L3 Harris Institute for Assured Information at Florida Institute of Technology. He's served in this role since August of 2015. Before joining academia, Dr. King served 14 years as a scientific research and program management professional in the United States intelligence community, where he created and managed research portfolios covering a broad range of topics related to biometrics and identity. Finally, Dr. Sam Peterson is a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. He has broad interests and expertise in topics within and outside of criminal justice, and his wide range of publications include a recent report entitled Finding a Broadly Practical Approach for Regulating the Use of Facial Recognition by Law Enforcement. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so if we can all mute until it's time for each one of us to talk, that might help. Okay, great. All clear on my end. So now that we've briefly introduced you all, let's jump right in. So for anyone in our audience who's not familiar with face recognition technologies, it might be helpful to start by providing examples and explanations of just a few functional applications and use cases. Patrick mentioned several of them, but let's just quickly go around and touch on a few more to level set for our audience. I'll start with Sam. I know you've extensively researched and written about law enforcement agencies' use of face recognition technologies. So could you please provide a brief overview of some of the ways in which law enforcement agencies use face recognition technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, project is really focused on understanding within law enforcement due to different risks of those use cases. So, things that are then looking at patients of facial recognition. Internet have used three kinds. Can't hear me. Gabrielle, try taking on that.
Yeah, Sam, here, let me jump to one of our other panelists and then we'll come right back to you.
Yeah.
Just give us, yeah, we'll circle right back. Okay, so before we hear about law enforcement applications, Tatiana, I know you and your colleagues at FPF have done extensive work on commercial face recognition technology use cases. So can you give us a brief overview of some of the ways in which folks in the commercial sector are using these technologies?
Yeah, of course. And thank you all so much for inviting me here. Actually, might make a lot of sense for me to go first, considering a lot of people who don't know about face recognition probably know about it in the commercial context. So biometric recognition is largely one of the strongest methods of identity management and security generally. So a lot of people are familiar with face recognition as it relates to opening up their phone and being able to use your face to be able to access anything that's on your device. Or a lot of businesses use it in the context of accounts, such as financial sector and banks will use face recognition to be able to access your financial information, because biometric recognition is such a high security protocol to be able to have that information as opposed to username and password. And it becomes even stronger with things like multi-factor authentication. It's also super common in the context of employees and employment, having specific access to specific buildings or specific databases if you're in the health sector. So those are some of the most common use cases that people are familiar with and businesses are using them. There's also the cases of, like retail theft prevention. So stores will have cameras in their facilities and they'll use face recognition on kind of two different spectrums. So one is what Patrick was talking about during his keynote, which is like kind of ongoing surveillance, which poses some of the questions around mass surveillance and Big Brother, where they're continuously running face recognition to make sure specific people are not entering their facility. They also have post-incident software, which is far less privacy risk has less privacy risk, because what you do is after an incident actually occurs, you're running a match on a specific frame of a specific video and running it against a database. So those are some of the most common use cases in the private sector.
Thanks so much for that, Tatiana. That's a great overview. Dr. King, I'll turn it to you. I know both your independent research and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine committee on which you serve has explored numerous face recognition technology use cases. So I'd love to hear your overview of some of the ways in which government agencies are using face recognition outside of that law enforcement context. Oop, Dr. King, you're muted.
Sorry. I think one of the most prevalent areas, at least is becoming to be one of the primary use cases for this, is the border control and protection. Just a few weeks ago, I was on my way back from Europe, and it was quite a good experience to use face recognition, both boarding the aircraft and, coming back into the country with very little friction at all. And so it's a way to enable frictionless travel. Of course, public safety and surveillance are also major use cases of the technology on the federal side. And all these things are really closely related when you begin to look at national security and countermeasures and things in that area. And lastly, aside from the law enforcement and investigations use case, pretty much any scenario where you would really need to verify one's identity, and as Patrick alluded to earlier as well, is to kind of ensure that you don't issue multiple credentials to one individual. So that's avoiding having one person with multiple identities in a database is another use case for this particular technology that's also really important.
That makes sense. Thanks for that. Sam, let's give it another shot. Let's see if your Wi-Fi is treating you better now.
Yeah, going so far, still delayed. I can
We're still
go
getting a
off
bit of
video.
feedback. It's a little bit garbled.
How about?
Still not quite working, but if you want to try to give, if you want to try to do a restart, we can keep going and jump back on to you once you log back in. All right, thanks everyone for rolling with this. It's the challenges of virtual webinars. While we wait for Sam to come back on, one of the things that I think makes face recognition technologies so challenging to address in legislation is that benefits and risks vary across the different functional applications and use cases that you all highlighted. And the different face recognition systems that achieve varying levels of accuracy and performance, which, as Patrick explained earlier, can also have different risks and benefits. And these risks and benefits aren't always equitably experienced across demographic groups. So, Michael, what do you think are some of the most notable benefits and risks of face recognition technologies across the public and private sectors? And do you want to share a bit about how you've heard from different communities about their experience with these benefits and risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest benefit to using these technologies in general is just convenience, and whether that is in time or if you're in the commercial sector, the overall cost with dealing with someone, and time always has its cost. I mean, one of the things I used to say about fake passwords when we started is that, they were great. Just how many can you remember, and how long, and how many special characters? And so to the extent that you can actually, use your face or just show up and be able to, uh, access a device that you would like to access, or get access to whatever benefit that you need to get access to. I mean, I think that is a great thing. Uh, you know, uh, Grother alluded to some of the risks in some communities. Right now we've heard about the 5 false arrests that occurred, and I don't want to go down too far down that road without actually acknowledging the most I mean, law enforcement duties are incredibly challenging, and by and large, the mass majority of them do their jobs in the most upstanding way possible. But that said, we do have the 5 cases of false arrests, probably different uses for each of the in each one of the cases. Um, but they're there and you can't ignore them. And so we do need to make sure that as we use these technologies and deploy them more and more, that we take steps to make sure that these types of things don't occur. He also mentioned the young lady, I believe that was I can't remember if that was Chicago or Detroit, but the young lady that was kicked out of the skating rink. But you also have the Rite Aid young man as well that was kicked out of a Rite Aid, being falsely accused of previously being involved with a theft. And so, I mean, as these technologies continue to proliferate and as they begin to um, continue to be used by people who are not that familiar with the technology at all and think that the technology is infallible. For instance, I mean, somebody could take that 100%, accuracy statement that Patrick made without looking at the long list of caveats that he also presented and think that, face recognition errors just don't occur. And when you hear people talking about it, they almost talk about it as that, all face recognition technologies are created the same. And that's just not the case. And so those are some of the biggest risks I think that we have, aside from just overall general surveillance. And I'll continue, but I'd like to also yield some time to some of my fellow panelists.
Thank you for that. So while we're missing Sam, Patrick has graciously agreed to step in and join our panel. So Patrick, we'll have you jump in as well, and Tatiana, feel free to chime in. But Patrick, if you want to jump in on Michael's point and illustrate, some of the ways in which accuracy can impact benefits and risks. If there's anything that you feel you didn't cover earlier, feel free to chime in here.
Yeah. So, I think my point, face recognition is very capable today. And in a Big Brother setting, if you happen to look at a camera and it's equipped with a good imaging system and it's equipped with a good face recognition system, then you would expect to get recognized if you're in a database. So if the Chinese government is out to get you and you walk around looking at cameras, you would expect to be found. That was my point about saying it's 100%. If you operate within that capture parameter envelope, then face recognition is going to work. Obviously, there's a lot of ways that you can arrange for it not to work. Baseball hat, sunglasses, don't look at the camera, only come out at night. A whole number of different steps that you can take. And, ironically, in Hong Kong, before the pandemic, the government in Hong Kong was saying, you're not allowed to wear face masks. And 9 months later, everybody has to wear face masks for different public policy objectives, right? So face recognition can succeed. It's increasingly capable, particularly at pulling out good faces from what you would call unconstrained images or less constrained images.
Yeah, I'll add on. I view the risks associated with face recognition in kind of two buckets, one being privacy and security, and then second being bias and discrimination. So first, with the privacy and security, biometric data at large and face recognition data tends to be some of the most sensitive forms of data that we have that are personal to us because it is completely unique to us and usually pretty much unchangeable, meaning if it's compromised, it's not like a financial information or like a social security number where you can just change it. It's kind of just out there with little recourse if it is compromised by a bad actor or anything else. And then there's also the risk, I think, that Patrick was talking about a little bit, as well as Dr. King, which is the risk associated with any kind of mass surveillance and having that kind of chilling effect on society, on our actions or speech, which is very well documented if that occurs. And then on the point of like bias and discrimination, so another point that Patrick had made is some of the largest issues associated with biased accuracy is the issue of false positives. So that means that somebody is being wrongly identified as opposed to the other way around. And especially when that kind of information is being tied, as I talked about before, to identity management, such as access to benefits or access to financial information or access to buildings, there are actual repercussions from having false identification systems being in place in which people are being stifled in the ability to go to work, participate in the market. All of these different things are even like more significant legal ramifications if you're being falsely arrested or falsely jailed for any kind of immigration violation that's being alleged.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think there are great points in there. I wanted to dive in a little bit on that, the nature of biometric data and what happens when it's compromised. I think this is a topic that gets a lot of attention from folks, and it's not often pulled apart in depth. You know, there are different, I think my understanding of it is a biometric template itself isn't generally readable to humans. But to your point, if there's a compromised incident and you are no longer able to use your biometric in a system that relies on biometrics, you can be in a really tough spot. Patrick and Michael, I know you two have heard from face recognition technology vendors. What do you have any insight into what, you know, the vendor's response is there if there is a situation where a particular template gets compromised through a morph or a hack or, you know, a variety of other factors?
Mike, you want to take a go or shall I? Okay, you're muted, so I will. So, okay, so, you know, the industry is a bit divided on this. They'll point out that faces aren't secrets, right? So I could do a screenshot right now. I've got 4 faces, and I could have a go at fabricating a face mask and trying to open your phone with it. Probably not successful. It's kind of a costly attack to do that. To make a good face mask is tricky. And I don't have access to your phone, right? So the security context is something as well. You will see people claiming that these templates are non-reversible. And that is a suspect claim. They would like to point out that if a database is compromised, that if you steal the templates, that they can be reversed, right? So if they can be reversed, then you could get an image out and then you could launch it, an attack. There are easier way to get face images. You know, take a picture of somebody in public when they leave their front door in the morning. If you're going to do a dedicated attack like that, if you find a phone in the street, you don't know who dropped it. So, you know, that's a different security context. Again, that's what the biometrics on phones are good at protecting. Central databases have got this famous vulnerability that they're a focal point, and that if you can compromise it, then you can run off with all the biometric data. Many databases include the face image and the template, maybe under different lock and key, but they tend to be both there.
Yeah. So the only thing I would add is that when it comes down to faces, I think each one of these biometrics kind of have to be dealt with individually. And if the discussion today is about face recognition and compromising templates, it was interesting one day. I wanted to get this clip for one of my upcoming talks. There was a person giving a talk on on one of the television news shows, 24-hour shows. And one of the things they pointed out was the concern about TSA using their face and it being compromised, if you will, because you only get one face. But the biggest risk to somebody using his face biometric was him being there on television in the first place. And so if you're really concerned about somebody being able to search a database using your face, then those images could be captured from literally anywhere. I mean, they could be acquired from websites. They could be acquired from, as Patrick just mentioned here today, in terms of a screen grab, right? And so I'd be much less concerned with someone extracting a biometric template, if you will, and trying to go through the reversal process to extract my face. Than I would from them just going to my university's webpage and pulling a picture that they can use to directly generate a template. And these templates tend to be, there's no template that actually works for all algorithms, right? So these algorithms have their unique template generation process. And so the biggest concern that you should have is on the raw data perspective, from my perspective, when it comes down to certainly people who are public facing.
That makes a lot of sense. And thank you for pulling that apart, and Tatiana for bringing it up, because this is a critical issue that I think policymakers are heavily focused on addressing and trying hard to understand. On the note of how policymakers are thinking about this, Tatiana, from your vantage point leading FPF's biometrics working group, what trends are you seeing in federal and state level legislation with implications for face recognition? And also, do legislative efforts seem to reflect a commitment to preserving any of the particular benefits or risks, or mitigating any of the particular risks that we just touched on?
Yeah, so I will first kind of get an overview of where things are at right now in order to form where trends are headed or where they are at right now. So currently there is 3 states that have biometric privacy laws that are private facing or consumer facing, right? So that's Illinois, Texas, and Washington. Illinois having arguably the strongest biometric data privacy law, arguably the strongest privacy law at large, because they have what's called a private right of action, which means that consumers can bring actions for violations of the act. It's not just attorney generals who are bringing these actions. And they also don't have to allege any kind of actual injury. It is sufficient for a company to just violate the law for them to be able to bring these claims. So a lot of policymakers have really been focusing on this law as a framework in other jurisdictions and wanting to copy that because it has been perceived as such a strong law. On the other side of that equation is all of the litigation that has happened because of this law. And unfortunately, not all the litigation has had not all of the litigation has been full of merit. So there has been some abusive litigation tactics, which have really made policymakers very wary of enacting kind of BIPA copycats with this private right of action with no injury requirement, because they don't want to have the issue of businesses not being in their state or offering certain products in their state at the same time. So there's a little bit of this balance of wanting to promote businesses being in their state, using this technology because it is a beneficial technology to society, but knowing that there has to be strong privacy and security requirements as well to be able to protect the consumer at the same time. There's also been a couple different moratoriums on the local level, and a couple that have always been introduced at the federal level. So Portland, Oregon, for example, is one jurisdiction that has implemented a full-out ban of facial recognition technology by both government and private entities. A lot of times moratoriums are mostly just focused on government use because there is such a high risk associated with that, with kind of false convictions and false arrests. However, again, there has been a lot of concern because of how biometric technologies have been valuable for law enforcement. So again, it's always this balancing act. And unfortunately, we haven't seen a ton of actual consensus of what the correct balance should look like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know some of the rest of you have also been looking into legislation. Sam, is there anything you want to add in particular on some of the legislative proposals focused on law enforcement's use of face recognition during the course of your research?
Yeah, sure. First, a sound check. I'm sounding better. Okay, great. Yeah, so when we were completing our project, there were a couple of new examples out of Massachusetts and Virginia with legislation focused directly on law enforcement use of facial recognition technology in terms of what's allowed, what's not allowed. And I think one of the things that you see across the few states that have policies or legislation already, they try to set up regulations around sort of who's doing the searching. So one approach is to have a centralized state facial recognition kind of an agency that does it. So usually that's state police, whereas some states allow any agency within the jurisdiction or within the state to use facial recognition on their own. So that's kind of the Florida example, where almost all of the police departments in Florida have kind of pooled their data together. They have this massive, mugshot database combined with state license data as their gallery source. So that structure seems to be pretty important. And then another key consideration is the level of authorization you need to use facial recognition. So one thing that I was going to mention earlier when you all couldn't hear me was, law enforcement a lot of them consider the use of facial recognition as more of a tip than something that's a formalized process or piece of evidence, which is why it often doesn't come out in court, which is a pretty big factor to consider. But so with that regard, is the standard suspicion, or do you have to go through an established probable cause, possibly even get a warrant? That's something that Massachusetts, I think, enacted. I think they were finalizing their report and the legislation at the time of my project, so I need to follow up on that actually. And then there's a variety of other things to consider. What gallery data can law enforcement use? Some states have banned Clearview AI, for instance, as being used by law enforcement. I'd say those are the big things. So the structure, the authorization, and then what data are they using, and do you have to notify people if their face is in a state or in a facial recognition database? Those are the big ones.
Thank you for that. And I'm curious, most of what you all have highlighted is state level activity. And I think, we've all seen that advancing federal face recognition technology legislation has proved pretty challenging. So I'm curious whether any of you see viable paths forward on face recognition technology legislation. And if so, which legislative approaches do you think would be most likely to move forward? So I'll start with Michael on this one, and then we can go around. Michael, you're on mute.
I've spoken a lot. I will give Tatiana and Sam an opportunity to chime in. I don't mind chiming in later, but I just want to be respectful for these guys.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, let's have Tatiana jump in and then we'll go over to Sam and then come back to you, Michael. Patrick, if you want to comment on legislation, feel free, but I won't put you on the spot to do that.
It's funny, I was actually going to say I shouldn't go first because I'm actually probably not going to actually talk about facial recognition legislation, because what we typically advocate is that a comprehensive data privacy approach is far superior to focusing on one form of data or one technology. But I think I'll start there in saying, because there is so many different forms of risks associated with general biometric data, and how it's so contextual on how it is used. So biometric data in one context that is used for identification might be used as Patrick was talking about age verification in another context, which is very different from identity management or identification. And that wouldn't fall under, for example, a biometric data privacy regulation, but it might fall under a general comprehensive privacy legislation. So a comprehensive approach is better able to approach these variety of risks as opposed to just one that is centered on a specific data or a certain technology.
Sam, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the federal level, some of the key considerations are, civil rights considerations, which would certainly, lead up to that level. I think, like many other kind of civil rights issues, it often requires court cases for legislation to kind of follow eventually. There doesn't seem to be a lot happening, although you do have federal law enforcement using facial recognition. FBI has their own training program. They have their faces database. So, I think for now, it seems at the federal level they're trying to see, and a lot of states are ignoring this as well. So I think we'll kind of have to wait and see a little bit on what that ends up looking like in the future, because there have been some attempts that have failed, and it's kind of hard to keep up with some of that.
Michael, you want to chime in on this?
Sure. I think some of the bigger challenges. Some people take a look at policies regulating the use of the technologies. Other people take a look at the developing policies regulating the use of data to train and develop these algorithms. I think first and foremost, I think we need to find a way to kind of coexist with the technology. And the other concern that we have is that, these policies, don't extend across the globe. And so the technology has a global reach. There are folks in various parts of the world that are developing the technology. And so, I think the vendors here would suggest that they need some viable some means of accessing data that is useful in the development of the algorithm. And so we have to be mindful of that. What the right answer is, I don't know. But I think we have to be mindful of those things. And so when these regulations are enacted or these policies are implemented, just the extent of the reach, we have to be mindful that other countries are going to continue to develop the technology. And some of the concern is web scraping or scraping images from the web of U.S. citizens. But anybody with access to the internet across the globe can access these images. And so if they're not able to be scraped here, they will be scraped from somewhere. And so I think those are the major things that I think we have to be rather mindful of.
All good points. I'd love to dive in a bit more to Tatiana's point about which approach is most effective. Tatiana, you hit on data privacy legislation, kind of broad consumer data privacy legislation specifically, if I understood correctly. But one of the other key issues occupying tons of attention in Congress is AI governance legislation. And, given the way that face recognition technologies are developed, some may consider them AI technologies. And so I would love to hear, Patrick, do you think that we should consider face recognition technologies to be AI technologies? And then I'd love to hear from the rest of you on how, if and how you think AI governance legislation should deal with face recognition technologies.
So you can build biometric algorithms on other technology that's not AI, and in the field of iris recognition, there are capable algorithms that are not built on AI. They're not even built on machine learning. That really doesn't apply to face recognition today. They are all built that way with machine learning and AI. Whether face recognition should be regulated under broad AI is not a clear slam dunk to me. The Europeans are developing AI legislation, as you know, and they explicitly took the step of supporting that with a set of standards. So ISO IEC international consensus standards, not even European standards, to put some strictures on how high risk biometrics are done. So this is biometrics applied to people passively when they're not even aware of being imaged. It could be in a casino, it could be in the street, it could be by a law enforcement agency, it could be by a private company. But they took the approach of supporting the legislation with some technical standards to do things like measure bias and minimize bias. And that's a work in progress. I think the EU legislation is a work in progress, and those technical standards also, but they're being developed quite quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that interplay between what do we want to have in hard law, so in legislation, and then what we would want to leave for regulatory action and or voluntary standards or other kinds of consensus frameworks is definitely a live discussion and an important one to carry forward. Sam, I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on this in the law enforcement context specifically or more broadly.
Yeah, and I think like Patrick mentioned, there are a few other biometric technologies that law enforcement agencies might be exploring, like gait analysis, object recognition, that could potentially have implications for investigations and also people's civil rights and bias and all those kinds of things. I guess one thing that came up in our project was the notion of having some kind of legislation around officer misuse of facial recognition technology. So, there have not been examples of this per se, but there have been other examples of misuse of access to law enforcement databases to find an ex-spouse or their new partner and things like that, which could certainly happen using facial recognition technology. So I think for the law enforcement setting, it's going to be a lot more maybe user focused. And so I think some of the more broad privacy or data legislation would suffice, but you'll still need some law enforcement specific legislation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is that use case specific differentiation depending on risks and other unique considerations that different types of technologies, not just face recognition, but also other AI technologies can pose across different settings. And I know that's something that, at least in our discussion with policymakers, they seem to be aware of and motivated to address on a bipartisan basis. Sitting at BPC, I'll point that out. Michael, how about you? Any thoughts on how face recognition would fit into broader AI governance legislation? Should we keep them separate? What do you think?
I think broader AI governance is likely going to be a challenge anyway. I mean, Patrick mentioned some of the old algorithms that work just fine in terms of iris recognition, but if you look at some of the more modern algorithms that are being developed, they're all based on some of the deep convolutional neural network. They're basically learned representations, some of the new ones. And I think you're going to continue to see that. And, I think the difference is now is that more of the consumer base is beginning to have access to these technologies. These technologies have always been around. They've been embedded in your cars. They've been embedded in making decisions about credit risk and those types of things, and even buying patterns, and trying to make it alert someone to say that this might be a fraudulent charge, right? Those are all have their roots in AI, and so it's not that this technology hasn't been around, but now you're getting into the sensitive spaces where people are saying, you know, developing databases on images that have been posted on social media. When I was really just trying to show my friends I was having a good time at a wedding or some other type of event. But now, these images are now being extracted and being placed in some database someplace for either development or actually some other commercialized use. And so I think it's going to be a challenge, and maybe the data privacy route is the route to go in trying to protect certain people. But I also think that you're going to see other technologies that are being born to help to protect people from themselves. And so some of the more privacy preserving technologies you may actually see being developed as well. And so it'll be very interesting to see where this AI governance really goes over time.
Absolutely. Definitely will be interesting. Tatiana, anything you want to add on that point before we head over to audience Q&A?
Yeah, I'll just quickly note again, data privacy, I think, solves a lot of issues, but specifically on the issue of bias and discrimination, it's worth noting that civil rights laws really already apply to these technologies based on how they're used, both in AI and facial recognition. If an AI is doing a task that ordinarily a human would do, and that task is otherwise regulated by civil rights law, whether that's housing, credit, whatever, the AI still falls under that regulation. I think the issue that a lot of businesses and entities are concerned about as it relates to enforcement and what regulators want is like, what is the correct standard? What is an appropriate level of bias or accuracy they should be aiming for, so that they can show the regulators that they are trying to do the right thing, or they're trying to comply with these civil rights laws, but they just want to know, like, what are the right benchmarks?
That's a great point, and one that I think several federal agencies will be very happy that you made on this webinar. I want to make sure we do address some of the questions from the audience, and I might not ask them verbatim just so I can cover as many areas as possible in the limited time we have remaining. But we did get a question on vulnerabilities in age estimation tools. So testing for vulnerabilities is kind of one issue, but then I'm also curious to hear your take on how the new social media laws that would require these kinds of age estimation tools could impact the broader data privacy and AI governance debate. Tatiana, if you want to just keep going and kind of discuss that there, I can then go around to everyone else.
Yeah, I'll start with more social kids safety bills and how it's really impacting the conversation in the space. So generally, there's a lot of misunderstanding about face recognition right now and biometric recognition. A lot of people don't understand the difference between like facial analysis and face recognition, and those being very distinct technologies, and often want to lump them together. And so specifically with these age verification requirements for these kids' safety bills, a lot of times they're not very specific on what they are looking for. Are they looking for identity verification in which somebody's uploading a government ID, in which they're able to see somebody's birth date and then doing a face match comparison to make sure that that person is above 18 or above 21? Or are they looking for age verification, which has a little bit lower of a privacy risk, in which you're not retaining really any personal data, you're just doing a facial analysis of whether they think this person is over the age of 18 or 21. And so again, I think as these laws continue to be introduced, there is a lot of conflation of these different technologies and how they're used.
That's really helpful. And pointing that out again and again, I think can be worthwhile because it is really complex, as you know, your remarks just demonstrated and Patrick's earlier presentation. Patrick, on that topic of testing for vulnerabilities, is there any work that NIST is planning to do in the future to see how things like a morph would impact age verification, or are you all looking purely at accuracy for the near future?
So we, at the beginning of this year, we ran a track of FRVT called Presentation Attack Detection. So is somebody trying to undermine the functioning of the system? And, you know, age estimation is sort of not worth doing because you could anticipate that, you know, children wanting to buy alcohol would do some manipulations to their face. So age estimation would have to be accompanied by this attack detection, this presentation attack detection. Kids being kids might also launch some other attacks, some more sophisticated attacks. And one of the questions in the chat, I think, had to do with injection attacks. An injection attack is essentially to subvert the internal hardware of the phone, the software and hardware of the phone, and to be able to put an image in without using the camera at all. And that is essentially a non-biometrics problem. That's a crypto problem or an electronics problem. But you know, a full system deployment would need to address this, and that is it is a focus of the identity management industry today. Yeah, and age verification would be no exception to that.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's very helpful. Sam, we had a question directly for you as well. The question is, I hear the term facial recognition database a lot. Do you have an example of what would constitute a facial recognition database in a law enforcement setting? I know your report dives into this a bit, but if you can give an overview now, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I think the most common example is the use of a mugshot database. So police using their arrest mugshots to search against, you know, for a surveillance video, for example, looking for a suspect. Yeah, and then there are, you know, some states allow state driver's license images to be used in facial recognition searches, and then of course you kind of have the broader Clearview example where it's all of social media being used. Yeah, not all, but yeah.
Yeah, and pros and cons to different approaches there, right? Like smaller databases versus larger.
Yeah,
you want to elaborate there?
Yeah, and I don't know if you all discussed this at all, but I was kind of interested in maybe Michael or Patrick's take on this. You know, mugshot data are commonly, and this goes to across a variety of parts of the criminal justice system, but mugshot data are commonly, you know, disproportionate in terms of people of color being represented in them, whereas facial recognition algorithms are, you know, commonly trained for the most part on you know, majority white faces or data sets that are, you know, more representative of society as a whole. So there's always a concern with mugshots about baked-in bias, but then with state driver's license databases, you're obviously expanding a lot further in terms of the number of images being searched, which you know, may create some accuracy questions as well. So I don't know if Michael or Patrick had any thoughts on that.
I like to think of it as a socio-technical problem. Who you put in criminal justice databases is the socio part. Predominantly men, you know, 20% women, and then of course the race imbalance that you pointed out. The technical part is what the algorithm does once it starts running searches on such a database. And that can lead to false positives and false negatives, and that should be addressed by algorithm developers and by people who populate databases with photos, in particular careful design and quality control of photos that go into databases. So it's socio-technical, and I guess most systems are socio-technical in some respect.
So that to piggyback on kind of what Patrick is alluding to, I mean, when you look at the analysis, even in a law enforcement context, just from a technical perspective, I don't necessarily see that the false arrests or the wrongful arrests should have actually occurred. And just when you look at the technical data and the results and the score distributions, and so I would say it a little bit differently. In each one of these databases, you have the number of times that you search a particular demographic, and then you have the overall representation of that demographic within the database. In the event that if you were to take the cases in well, any of those cases in terms of the wrongful arrest, you don't have a guarantee that the person that you're looking for is in the database, period. And there has to have been searches of across demographics if the technology is being applied equally across demographics. And you likely would have had situations where for multiple demographics where the person was just not there, right? And that's the reason why you insert a human as kind of the safeguard. But that process in and of itself is rather subjective in terms of who gets put forth as an investigative lead, when does it occur, and the overall quality of the data that's being used in the search as well. And so for there to have been 5 instances of wrongful arrest, all of them involving Black men or African American men, however you want to use the reference. I don't know that you can put that solely on the technology, but you also can't eliminate the technology because it was involved in the process. And so that's what I would leave there. And so I think whenever we're talking about the overall accuracy of the technology, we have to also make sure that we include these caveats because false positives will occur. And if the person is not in the database, given the configuration that a lot of the law enforcement agencies use, the entire candidate list, as Patrick has pointed out on many occasions, is simply full of errors.
Okay, that is exactly a point that I would love to be able to discuss so much further with all of you, but we are over time. So I am going to have to wrap us up. But first, I just want to thank all of you so much for being here today, for your very insightful remarks. I want to thank the audience for their engagement and the great team at BPC, not just the tech team, but also our comms and our IT teams for all their help today. If anyone in the audience is still, itching to ask questions to these folks, I do encourage you to reach out to all of them. I'm also available at BPC, as is the Technology Projects Director, Tom Romanoff. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We're looking forward to continuing the conversation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.